with arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest living comedian, Chris Rock. Chris got slapped in the face at the Oscars by Will Smith, which was one of the craziest things I'd ever seen.
The story most people believe about Jim Carrey isn't the whole truth. In the 1990s, he was the biggest comedy star in Hollywood, delivering massive hits and becoming one of the first actors to command $20 million per film dollars. But two fearless comedians, Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, have each hinted at a very different side of the man behind the rubber-faced legend. So what exactly have they said about Jim Carrey over the years? And why does it paint a picture that doesn't quite match the legacy many fans remember? Join us as we unveil what these comedians revealed about Jim Carrey, the man who built an empire on being impossible to ignore. Jim Carrey grew up poor in a way that shaped everything that came after. His father, Percy, was a musician who sacrificed his dream to work as an accountant to support the family. When Jim was 12, Percy lost that accounting job. The entire family moved into a Volkswagen camper van and later lived in a tent on a relative's lawn in Burlington, Ontario. Jim, still a teenager, worked 8-hour overnight shifts as a janitor at a tire factory after school, coming home, doing a full shift at the factory, then going back to school the next morning. He told James Lipton on Inside the Actor's Studio, "I was going to school, and after school I was doing an 8-hour shift in the factory. That was not a summer job, that was survival. But the poverty, as grinding as it was, wasn't the deepest wound." His mother, Kathleen, struggled with hypochondria and severe depression and spent long periods bedridden and dependent on pain pills. Jim would go into her room and do impressions of praying mantises, throw himself down the stairs, bounce off walls, anything to make her laugh, anything to make her feel something other than what she was feeling. Jim dropped out of high school at 16 and moved to Toronto to do stand-up. He was bombing badly at first, a teenager in a plaid suit getting nothing from indifferent nightclub audiences. He wrote himself a fake check for $10 million and dated it for Thanksgiving 1995. He kept it in his wallet and looked at it when the failure got too loud. He moved to Los Angeles and started grinding the Laugh Factory and the Comedy Store. Gradually, the act evolved from imitation into invention, a specific, manic, physically impossible style of comedy that made audiences feel like the laws of nature had been temporarily suspended.
It was a frozen, hostile wasteland.
In a room full of people who needed to laugh, he was the closest thing to magic they had ever seen. The television show in living color put him in front of a national audience starting in 1990. Then came 1994, the year that made him the most commercially dominant comedy star in the world. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber. 3 films released in a single calendar year that collectively grossed over $500 million worldwide and turned him from a sketch comedian into a cultural phenomenon. Warner Brothers subsequently paid him $20 million to headline Batman Forever, the first comedy actor ever to command that fee for a single film. The fake check he'd kept in his wallet was outdated before Thanksgiving 1995 even arrived. But here's the part of that story that gets overlooked. At the exact peak of his commercial dominance, Jim Carrey was on Prozac. He told 60 Minutes in 2004 that he had been on Prozac for a long time. He described the medicated state as a low level of despair you live in. The most physically exuberant comedian in Hollywood was describing the interior of his professional peak as a permanent low-grade numbness. The performance that looked like boundless joy was, in significant part, a man managing something that had no name in the rooms he was performing for. He eventually came off the medication entirely. He said the depression evolved. He came to believe that depression was the psyche's refusal to keep performing a character it no longer believed in. So what happens when a man that is trapped inside a performance, revered by an industry, starts making choices in private that the performance can't cover for? Dave Chappelle went on Netflix and made Jim Carrey the punchline. In late 2023, Dave Chappelle released a Netflix special called The Dreamer. And the way he chose to open it, the very first story he told the audience was about Jim Carrey as the setup for a joke about being deeply disappointed. Dave described himself as one of the biggest Jim Carrey fans in the world. He said that Norm Macdonald, one of the most revered comedians of his generation, had offered to take him to the set of the 1999 film Man on the Moon, in which Carrey was playing comedy legend Andy Kaufman. Dave was genuinely excited. This was a chance to meet one of his actual heroes. Norm Macdonald himself was brokering the introduction. The anticipation was real. What he found when he arrived on set was that Carrey had gone so deep into method acting and had committed so fully to inhabiting Kaufman that he refused to break character for a single second off camera. The crew had been instructed to call him Andy, not Jim, for the entire shoot. When Dave arrived and called out, "Jim Carrey," the crew shushed him, told him to call him Andy. Dave, who had come specifically to meet Jim Carrey, had to spend the entire afternoon interacting with someone who was insisting, in front of everyone, that he was Andy Kaufman. The full behind-the-scenes documentary, Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, is on Netflix, and it shows exactly how far the performance went. Directors, crew members, and castmates described the experience with a mixture of awe and visible unease. By the end of the documentary, even the people who were there seemed uncertain where Andy Kaufman ended and Jim Carrey began. "I was very disappointed," Chappelle said on the special, "because I wanted to meet Jim Carrey, and I had to pretend this was Andy Kaufman all afternoon, and he was clearly Jim Carrey. I could look at him, and I could see he was Jim Carrey. Anyway, I say all that to say, that's how trans people make me feel." One of the greatest comedians alive, a man who had called Jim Carrey a personal idol, used Jim Carrey's defining professional characteristic as an analogy for something he found annoying and false, not a tribute wrapped in a punchline, an indictment wearing one. And Chappelle was not the only major comedian with something pointed to say.
"And I would never play an arena before I saw you do it. You made me dream bigger, and you're younger than me."
Because while Chappelle was talking about who Carrey refused to be on set, Chris Rock had already, years earlier, said something quieter and just as sharp about who Carrey had chosen to become off it. Chris Rock said the quiet part, out loud. Chris Rock and Jim Carrey are often mentioned in the same breath, two of the 1990s most dominant comedy forces, contemporaries who represented fundamentally different approaches to the same art form. Jim was physical chaos and facial transformation, while Chris Rock was precise language and moral ferocity. They operated in different registers but occupied equivalent cultural real estate through the same golden decade of comedy, which is exactly what made what Rock said about Carrey's career trajectory so pointed. In a 2005 interview with The Guardian, Chris Rock was asked about the career move of crossing from comedy into dramatic Hollywood stardom, the exact trajectory Carrey had pursued with The Truman Show in 1998, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind in 2004. Rock's response was immediate and direct. He said he did not want to be the next Jim Carrey, not as a throwaway remark, as a deliberate and specific career statement. He said, "I don't want to ask my fans to come and not laugh at me. Hey, come on, let's go see Chris Rock not be funny." Then he said the line that contains everything. "It ain't a better performance than in Dumb and Dumber. Sit with that." Chris Rock, one of the most critically respected comedians in the world, was saying that Jim Carrey's pursuit of dramatic legitimacy, his awards season repositioning from rubber-faced comedy god to Sundance-worthy dramatic actor, was not an improvement. It was a lateral move at best, and a vanity project at worst, and Chris Rock knew his own audience well enough to know that the trade, laughter for prestige, joy for awards consideration, was not one his fans would thank him for making. What Chris was identifying without spelling it out was the central contradiction of Jim Carrey's second act. A man who was genuinely, historically great at one thing, spending the second half of his professional life trying to convince everyone he was also something else. The physical genius wasn't enough. He needed Cannes. He needed Golden Globe nominations for drama.
You know what this means, don't you? I'm a shoo-in for the Blockbuster Award.
He needed critics to say his name alongside Daniel Day-Lewis, and every time he got close, The Truman Show, Man on the Moon, Eternal Sunshine, the industry appreciated it, but didn't fully canonize it. The comedy world he'd left behind watched and waited, and the dramatic world he was trying to enter never fully let him in either. The relationship losses during this period added another layer to the picture. He married Melissa Wummer in 1987, had a daughter Jane, and they divorced in 1995. He married actress Lauren Holly in September 1996, and they divorced less than a year later in 1997. Then he met Renee Zellweger on the set of Me, Myself, and Irene in 1999. He reportedly fell for her immediately and was described by the film's director Peter Farrelly as being sick over her. They started dating after filming Wrapped, became engaged, and attended the 2000 Golden Globes together as one of Hollywood's most photographed new couples. By December 2000, it was over. In his 2020 semi-autobiographical book, Memoirs and Misinformation, he called her the great love of his life. In a Howard Stern interview that same year, he said, "She was special to me, very special." 20 years later, still the great love of his life, the director of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Michel Gondry, reportedly cast Ellen Pompeo as Naomi, Joel's ex-girlfriend in the film, specifically because of her resemblance to Zellweger, deliberately using Jim Carrey's fresh Heartbreak to fuel the performance. Jim told Vanity Fair he was annoyed by it, and then conceded it probably worked. His best dramatic performance was built on grief he hadn't finished processing. The art was real. The cost was real, and the questions being raised about his private behavior during and around these years were about to get very real too. Because then came the 2022 Oscars, and Jim Carrey, unprompted, with maximum passion, declared himself the moral authority on physical boundaries at award ceremonies, and the internet went to work. The footage that buried him. On March 28, 2022, Will Smith walked across the Oscars stage and slapped Chris Rock on live television. The room sat in stunned silence. Then, incomprehensibly, gave Smith a standing ovation when he won Best Actor minutes later.
They aren't you. They don't have the history you do.
Yeah, I think the history might be the problem.
It was one of the most dissonant moments in the history of awards television, and Jim Carrey chose to make himself central to the public response. The following morning, Jim Carrey appeared on CBS Mornings and delivered what became one of the most quoted celebrity reactions to the slap. He said he was sickened. He said Hollywood was spineless en masse for how the room had responded. He said Smith should have been arrested on the spot. He said that if he had been in Chris Rock's position, he would have announced a $200 million lawsuit the following morning, because that video is going to be there forever. That insult is going to last a very long time, he said with emphasis. You do not have the right to walk up on stage and smack somebody in the face because they said words. Within 24 hours, a video from the 1997 MTV Movie Awards had accumulated over 2 million views on social media. Newsweek covered the resurfacing of the footage here. The video showed a then 35-year-old Jim Carrey approaching the stage to accept his award for Best Comedic Performance. Presenting it was Alicia Silverstone, who was 20 years old. As Jim Carrey reached the podium, he grabbed Silverstone's face with both hands and forcibly kissed her on the mouth in front of a stadium full of people. Alicia appeared visibly shocked. She physically pulled away and looked uncomfortable. The audience laughed because in 1997, a 35-year-old man grabbing a 20-year-old woman and kissing her without her consent at an awards show was apparently a comedy moment. Jim Carrey reportedly apologized backstage. Alicia has never spoken publicly about it. The internet's response to Jim's Oscars commentary was immediate and one-worded: hypocrite. He had delivered a speech about physical boundaries, about the right of people not to be subjected to unwanted contact at award shows, about how that video would exist forever as a testament to someone's behavior, while a widely available video showed him doing precisely what he'd condemned to a young woman who hadn't asked for it at an awards show on live television. A second clip from the same 1997 ceremony surfaced, showing Jim attempting to kiss Will Smith himself as Will walked to the stage. A younger Will Smith physically stopped him, grabbing him by the neck. The audience treated it as comedic. What it actually showed, a man making repeated unsolicited physical contact with multiple people at the same awards ceremony, was only visible in retrospect once the framing shifted. The full irony was total.
Watching a river, or a beautiful sunset, just something natural, beautifully untouched by man.
The man condemning Will Smith for unwanted physical contact at an awards show had his own archived footage of exactly that behavior sitting in a public video library. untouched, searchable by anyone with a browser. But the 1997 footage, as damaging as it was, is not the worst thing in the public record under Jim Carrey's name. What came next involved a death, 2 lawsuits, therapist notes, documented allegations, and a level of silence from Hollywood that itself tells a story. Questions left unanswered. In September 2015, a 30-year-old Irish makeup artist named Catriona White was found dead in her Los Angeles home. She had overdosed on a combination of prescription medications, propranolol, zolpidem, and oxycodone. The coroner ruled it a self-harm. Jim Carrey had been her on-again, off-again boyfriend since 2012. He released a statement that described her as a truly kind and delicate Irish flower, too sensitive for this soil, to whom loving and being loved was all that sparkled. Within a year, 2 separate wrongful death lawsuits had been filed against him.
The electron's steady-state oscillation can either have the 2 values separated by pi.
One by Catriona's estranged husband, Mark Burton. One by her mother, Bridget Sweetman. They were eventually consolidated into a single complaint and represented by Michael Avenatti, then one of the most high-profile plaintiff's attorneys in the United States. The allegations were detailed and specific. The plaintiffs alleged that Jim had illegally obtained prescription under a false name, that the medications used in her overdose had come from him. They submitted as evidence an STD test that returned positive results for herpes 1 and 2, chlamydia, and hepatitis. The name on the test was Jose Lopez. They alleged this was a medical alias Carrey used, sharing his birth date, which he had apparently used until 2013 before switching to a different alias. The implication of the alias itself, that he had a documented history of seeking medical care under false names, was its own separate line of inquiry that received very little mainstream coverage. Catriona White's therapist's notes, obtained and reported on during the litigation, painted a picture of the relationship that was deeply disturbing. The notes described Carrey smashing a computer against a wall during what they called a drug-induced rage while White was present. They described him calling her worthless, a bitch, and a piece of shit during an argument over a confidentiality agreement he wanted her to sign. They described Catriona manifesting early signs and symptoms of PTSD from the relationship. They described her being unable to sleep through the night because of fear that Carrey would burst into her apartment and hurt her. They described recurring nightmares in which he was raging at her. A note found on her iPad, allegedly written by her to Carrey in April 2013, alleged that he had introduced her to. The note was filed as evidence in the public record. Carrey's legal response was aggressive and consistent across every filing. He countersued, alleging the entire action was an extortion attempt, that the plaintiffs had fabricated the STD allegations specifically to exploit a famous actor's fear of public scandal. He alleged that Catriona herself had previously participated in an extortion scheme against him in 2013 using the same STD claims, and that he had privately resolved that situation, meaning he had paid to make it go away. His attorneys filed declarations asserting the lawsuits were coordinated, funded, and executed as a financial extraction operation using Catriona White's death as cover. The case was dismissed in January 2018. Both complaints were withdrawn, and no trial was ever held. No verdict was reached. The reasons were never publicly disclosed. What remained was the permanent, unretracted, publicly accessible record. The allegations, the therapist notes, the iPad message, the STD test, filed under a name that was not his. None of it adjudicated. All of it is still there. He had said, speaking about Will Smith, that the video was going to be there forever, that the insult was going to last a very long time. He was talking about a slap captured on camera at an awards show. He appeared not to consider, in that moment, what else was already sitting in a permanent and accessible archive under his own name. And after all of it, where does a man like Jim Carrey actually end up? What does the rest of his life look like when the record says what it says? The disappearance. Since the lawsuits were dismissed and the Oscars commentary detonated on him, Jim Carrey has retreated from Hollywood in a way that has the feel of permanence. Multiple sources have reported he turned down 3 to 4 film offers per year, sometimes worth $5 or $6 million each, because he simply doesn't want to do them. He moved to Hawaii. He paints. He has described painting as the one creative act that doesn't require him to perform a version of himself for another person's expectations. No director, no studio, no audience waiting for the rubber face. He made a short documentary called I Needed Color about his visual art practice. In it, he says, "The bottom line with all of this, whether it's performance or art or sculpture, is love. We want to show ourselves and have that be accepted." The documentary has been viewed over 5 million times. For a man who spent 30 years showing the world the most maximally exaggerated version of himself, the idea that he spent his post-Hollywood period making a 6-minute film about painting as an act of authentic self-expression carries a specific and somewhat melancholy weight. He came back briefly for the Sonic the Hedgehog films and told the Associated Press in late 2024 with a candor that was either completely disarming or quietly sad. "I bought a lot of stuff, and I need the money, frankly." For a man who was once paid $20 million per picture, the admission sits strangely. The Lad Bible profile on why he left Hollywood and what his life looks like now is here. He has spoken extensively about the ego dissolution that meditation and spiritual practice have produced in him, about reaching a point where Jim Carrey feels like a character he once played, rather than a self he actually inhabits. Dave Chappelle said he could look at Jim Carrey and see Jim Carrey, that the real man was clearly in there, behind the performance, and the performance was the problem. Chris Rock said he explicitly did not want to end up following Jim Carrey's career path, chasing dramatic legitimacy at the expense of the authentic thing he actually was. And maybe that's the real story of Jim Carrey, a man who spent decades making the world laugh, while slowly stepping further away from the spotlight that made him famous. Dave Chappelle questioned the performance, Chris Rock questioned the direction, and the internet questioned the contradictions. But in the end, the biggest mystery might still be the same one it's always been: the man behind the performance. Do you think Jim Carrey was misunderstood? Or do Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle see something about him the public ignored for years? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.